everyone, and welcome to Data Sharing, Privacy and Consent in the World of 6G. My phone just rang a moment ago and reminded me that I'm still on 3G, so there's some way for me to go yet to get into the future. But I'm Marina Yastreboff, President of the Australian Society for Computers and the Law, and very keen to hear the panel we have assembled here today. I join you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, Australia, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Certainly the race towards 6G is on. It's ready and it's running fast. It's involving a whole lot of, or countless devices, sensors, autonomous applications, and it is a fundamental enabler of future smart everything. Smart services, smart houses, cities, factories, even smart governments. Well, that also ushers in multidimensional flows of incredible amounts of data. And that data of all types, personal, highly sensitive, and just the mundane bits and bytes, is transferred between multiple parties. Now, those of you in the audience who are lawyers or even not lawyers, you would immediately identify the need to look at the privacy aspects of this. And does consent apply in this environment? If so, who's providing that consent and to whom? Who is accountable? It's also a question for our existing regulatory frameworks. Are they adequate? Are they up to the task? These core concepts will be explored today by our wonderful panel. So let me go straight to introducing you to our panelists. Dr. Ian Oppermann is the New South Wales Government Chief Data Scientist and Industry Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. He is the President of multiple societies, including the Australian Computer Society, the Australian National Committee for IEC, the JTCI, there are many acronyms, Strategic Advisory Committee, and a fellow of even more associations, including the Australian Academy for Technological Sciences and Engineering. He has 30 years experience in the ICT sector and has held several senior management roles here in Australia as well as over there in Europe. As the Director of Radio Access Performance at Nokia, Global Head of Sales Partner at Nokia Siemens Networks, and the Divisional Chief and Flagship Director at CSIRO here in Australia. He has contributed to 6 books, 120 papers, and has been cited more than 4,000 times. Well done, Ian. Now over to Professor Jay Go, Distinguished Professor and Founding Director of Global Big Data Technologies Centre at the University of Technology, Sydney. Prior to his appointment there, he served as the Research Director of CSIRO and had held several senior technical leadership positions in companies including Fujitsu and Siemens in the United Kingdom. His research interests include B5G, 6G, mmWave, and terahertz communications and sensing systems, as well as big data technologies. He's published 5 books and over 550, there's so many statistics in these bios, but it's really enjoyable reading them out, 550 research papers and holds 26 patents. The professor is also a fellow of the Australian Academy for Engineering and Technology, the IEEE and the IET. He is the recipient of multiple prestigious awards here in Australia, including the CSIRO Chairman's Medal. And he is named as one of the most, multiple times he has been named the most influential engineer in Australia. Thank you for joining us, Professor. Peter Leonard, it's now your turn. Peter is an Australian-based data and technology business lawyer and the principal of Data Synergies. It's a leading advisory firm on all things technology. A professor of practice over at the University of New South Wales Business School, Peter is also the founding partner of a leading Australian law firm called Gilbert and Tobin. In his other leadership positions, Peter chairs the Australian IoT Internet of Things Alliance, Data Access and Use Workstream, the Law Society of New South Wales Privacy and Data Law Committee, and the Australian Computer Society's Artificial Intelligence and Ethics Technical Committee, and is a member of the New South Wales Government AI Advisory Committee. We're nearly there. Our last panellist, but by no means the least, Aurelie Jacquet. Aurelie is also a member of the New South Wales Government AI Advisory Committee and works on leading global initiatives on the implementation of responsible artificial intelligence. She is the chair of the Standards Committee IT 043, definitely work that you should be following, and represents Australia on a number of international standards boards, including the IEEE. There is so much to be said here, but let me scroll a little bit forward. She's a member of the European AI Alliance and editorial board of Springer's International Journal on AI and Ethics, and of the Australian Computer Society AI Ethics Committee. And quite excitedly, just recently, Aurelie was recognised by an award, that is the Australian New Zealand Women in AI Awards, and was recognised also by the Women in AI Ethics by that group as one of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics globally. For us, you're our number one, Aurelie. Thank you for joining us today. So this is how we're going to run the session. Dr. Oppermann will open with a presentation, then we'll move to an interactive panel discussion. If you have any questions throughout, please place those in the Q&A function. We'll be moderating those and address as many of those questions as we can after our panel discussion. If you want to direct a question to any particular member of the panel, please indicate their name and we'll hand it in that direction. So Ian, it's now time for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marina. And Alex, if you could do the honours for me with the slides. So folks, we've got a fairly unusual presentation and session for you this afternoon. It's great to see the number of people attending. It's also great to see some friends in the audience. As you got from Marina's presentation, we've got 2 IEEE fellows as part of this conversation tonight, but we've also got 2 lawyers and someone who's chairing a standards organisation. And so what we wanted to do was take you a little bit away from just the tech and talk about what are the consequences. Because in order for 6G to really genuinely come to life, we need to not only address the technological challenges. We talk about terahertz communication, we talk about materials, we talk about doing clever things around energy, but we also have to deal with the societal impact of all that communication, all that connectivity, and what do we actually mean by privacy? What do we actually mean by consent? So tonight, for us here in Sydney, Australia, tonight is all about thinking about some of those other issues that when you go back into your research community and think about all the super clever ways of providing ubiquitous, anytime, anywhere connectivity, you've also got in mind some of the challenges around privacy, first and foremost, secondly, consent. So let me press on. And I'm joining you tonight as an industry professor from the University of Technology in Sydney, as opposed to my role as New South Wales Government Chief Data Scientist, because it's a little easier to talk to as a university guy than it is to talk to you as a government person. But let's press on. Alex, next slide, please. So 6G is targeted at the world of 2030, which is wonderful. And we have more or less started to see a Moore's law of Gs. Every 10 years, we get a G. So most of the world is now catching up to 5G and 2020-ish. And 6G is targeted at 2030. But there's a really important framing of the world of 2030 that we need to think about. And that's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are 16 goals, which talk about how we want the world to look like. So we've reframed the conversation about all the rush about getting somewhere to what should that somewhere look like when we get there. We talk about in the UN Sustainability Goals, and almost every country in the world has signed up to these goals, including Australia. It said, we agree, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being. And the one that I'm really interested in, sustainable cities and communities, smart places. And we've said, this is what an outcome looks like. These are the ways of describing the future. These are the indicators which underpin those outcomes. And then we start to think about all the different data sets that we need to help us understand that journey of child, family, household, community. Child, family, household, for example, in the case of no property, but community in the sense of how we build a community and the points of friction that lead us towards or away from the outcomes we want to achieve in these sustainability goals. But there are a couple of really, really, really big challenges. The world of 2030 is a long way in the future. The world of 2030 is safely in the future. The world of 2030 is influenceable by what we do at the moment. And communications impacts every one of these goals. For those of you who've been on the journey, those of you, I don't know who's quite in the audience, but those of you who remember this thing called GSM, great idea, around for a long time, changed the world, improved productivity, connected people, connected markets, and actually fundamentally changed the world in terms of access to markets and access to education, access to finance, moved the world. 3G moved it further, 4G moved it further, 5G started to talk about not so much people, but devices talking to each other. 6G said, we will continue that journey of fundamentally underpinning all the things we want to do through productivity, connectivity, and availability. And when we think about what we're trying to achieve, putting in place outcomes frameworks like the sustainability goals are a really good way to think about why we're doing what we're doing, how we describe that future world, and all the things we might need to do and understand those points of friction that help us move towards or away from those goals. Alex, next slide, please. It also creates global markets. And I mentioned that the Gs have been sort of ticking along at a fairly regular basis. It's like Moore's law now. Every 10 years, we get a new G. And so 2030, on the time of 6G, this is the world we're looking to put this technology into. But of course, 2030 and 6G is not the end of the story. Today, on our planet, we know we have approximately 7.6 billion people. By 2030, when 6G comes around, we'll have approximately 8.5 billion people. No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We've got what we've got. We are building a world where we expect more people to live longer, to live in urban environments, and to have higher expectations of quality of life, but an extra billion people with the natural resources that we've got. So we actually have a sustainable intensification challenge as we try to add an extra billion people to the planet and improve everybody's quality of life as we all exhibit these trends of living longer and urbanization and that expectation of a better quality of life. We start to realize we've got some aspects which don't quite fit. And of course, 2030 is not the end of the line. By 2050, the UN's done some really good work thinking about the population. By then, 9.7 billion people compared to today, an extra 2 billion people. Again, no more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have, but an extra 2 billion people living longer, living in a more urban environment, and with an expectation of increased quality of life. And we also know that the climate is changing, where we can draw calories is changing, the way we need to live our lives is starting to change, and it will be accelerating through that change. And we also know that if we keep going with the Gs, that 6G is also not the end of the story, but by 2050, we're probably going to be talking about 8G. Next slide, please, Alex. So the context of what we're thinking about as we sit here and face what 6G, why 6G, how 6G, are these global megatrends of population change, increase in population, aging population, urbanizing population, global climate change, but also the fact that we're increasingly dependent on increasingly complex systems that we have as individuals less and less understanding of and less control of. So we expect systems to be trustworthy, to be secure, to be guaranteed in terms of how they operate, to be seamless. We want to walk into a network and just have it operate. We don't want to do a download of a software update in order to actually access the network. Increasingly, we'll expect it to be green. The amount of energy, the planet's total energy budget we're prepared to spend on communications is likely to change our thinking. But importantly, privacy preserving. We want to be able to interact in a way which still allows us to adhere to what we understand as privacy principles, but also the pretty heavy regulatory environment, such as described by GDPR, where if we get it wrong, we face some pretty stiff penalties. Alex, next slide, please. So that's 2030. Let's talk about today. Let's talk about some tech that exists right now. Let's talk about a smart home. It's pretty cool. You can walk into your smart home and lights turn on. You move to another room, lights turn on and turn off in the previous room. And just the smart lighting can be really quite efficient and highly personalized, which means that not only do you save money on energy, but the person or the organization providing the smart lighting can harness the information about where you are and when you are and which room you're occupying to actually shape total demand or total supply to not only a house, but to a suburb. So the potential for local efficiencies and local optimization is quite significant. But we all know that smart homes for a long time have been more about just smart lighting. Bottom right-hand picture talks about a toaster. And again, those of you who are old enough to remember the conversations about every device connected to every other device will know about the famous toaster talking to the refrigerator conversation. Always wondered what they would actually say. What would a toaster say to a refrigerator? Do you want toast? And what would the refrigerator say back? But the ability for all these devices to be connected means that, interestingly, future services could start to manifest. For example, if you had where our dream is ubiquitous, connected, mobile environment, if we start to think about weaving communications devices into the fabric of our clothing, then our shirt becomes a receiver. Our shirt might even become a hop in a node to get to our neighbor's house in order to reduce energy consumption. And all of the smart devices might actually start talking to each other. So the question starts to become, well, what if all of these things enable ubiquitous, low power communication? But what if your shirt is now a device or a hop in a network? What if local network optimization is based on what you're looking at the time, and that information about your gaze, your direction, your level of attention starts to feed back into the services you're being offered? What if services offered to you are based on your food preferences and hunger? What if the fridge starts to engage with you about what you should be eating as opposed to what you're interested in? And what if, interestingly, your shirt, your fridge, and your toilet start monitoring your health and well-being? And interestingly, if your location starts to form part of your distributed decryption algorithm to say, well, because you're standing in front of the fridge under these circumstances, you will not actually be able to open the fridge. So we start to get to questions. Next slide, please, Alex. We start to get questions around, what do we mean by personal information? Is my location personal information? Is what I'm doing and my context personal information? And is all of this something that I actually give consent to? Let me take another example of real tech right now. So in fact, one of the last standards meetings I went to was in South Korea, and I landed at the airport in Incheon and walked up to these little devices, which are clearly robots, and said, tell me how to get to Terminal 2, because I have a meeting which I need to take a flight to. And we increasingly see autonomous, intelligent devices appearing in a range of different areas. These clearly are fun robots doing fun things. But increasingly, we're seeing robots in agriculture, in manufacturing, in hospitality, in healthcare, in a range of different areas. And Japan is arguably at the leading edge of using autonomous, intelligent devices. And I think they're kind of cool. And we know they can augment human activity, and they can be more efficient, and there are a range of different areas we can apply them. Next slide, next tab, please. But the same questions start to apply. If I interact with this robot and say to it in the language that I speak, I want to go to Terminal 2, it interprets the language I'm speaking, gives me directions, and offers me advice. There are a couple of really important questions. It's probably an inefficient process to try to understand the language I'm speaking. It's probably much better if the robot could interact with my Outlook or my calendar and actually just read where I'm going in an unambiguous way and give me better advice. But there are a couple of other questions about robots and devices, which we all know, and things like power budget and things like energy are really quite significant. So what if the advice or the location or the availability of these robots is actually based on their needs and not mine? What if the services offered to me are based on what's learnt about me and the hundreds of other people they engage with and delivered back to me? I'm part of the algorithm, I'm part of the learning. And do I agree to that? What if the robot actually harvests energy from my interaction with the robot, so an energy harvesting approach, whilst I'm engaging it? And am I actually consenting to handing over my energy to this robot? And what, of course, if my data forms part of a future robot knowledge base, can I practically be removed? And so we start to be able to ask questions. Can I tell if it's a robot? In this case, clearly, yes. Does it matter if I can tell? How is this robot qualified? Who's responsible if it gives me bad advice? Can I trust it? What's happening to my data? And also, how informed is my consent? We typically do not consider the energy that we interact with the device to be something we would consent or to be personal information. But for years, we've talked about energy harvesting devices which scavenge energy from an interaction. And am I really able to consent to that? Next slide, please, Alex. Last one, existing devices, drones. I also think they're pretty cool. In Australia, we've got some great devices which are doing surf life saving and doing shark spotting. They're pretty cool. They're used in communication, surveillance, agriculture, and safety. Next tab, please, Alex. But the same issues start to appear. What if a drone is operating up in my personal space? What if it's above my house for 24 hours or 48 hours or 30 or so on? And what if I don't know it's there? What if it's measuring surface temperature for environmental reasons, but it also manages to measure my temperature as an individual? And what if the services offered are based on what it learned about me? And what if my data forms part of a future drone knowledge base? The same sorts of questions start to apply. Drones are obvious parts of the solution for ubiquitous coverage for 6G. But can I tell the drone is there? Does it matter if it's there? Who's responsible for my interaction with that drone? Can I trust it? What's happening with all my data, and how informed is my consent? My body temperature is typically not something I would consider to be personal information. COVID has possibly changed that perspective. But if this drone is measuring my body temperature for 24, 48 hours, am I actually able to give consent to that? And how do I feel about that really quite personal information being used for a range of different purposes? Next slide, please. So one of the things that we must think about is not just the tech. I'm going to do a very quick ad for Finland's 6G flagship, the world's first 6G research program, which kicked off in 2018. And they're looking at connectivity, devices and circuits, distributed computing, services and applications. 251 million euros allocated to this area. It's now become really quite a global collaboration. And I encourage all of you to have a look at the 6G waves or the 6G channel activity, which describes where they're up to. And it's multidisciplinary, but it's typical engineering multidisciplinary. A lot of physical layer, a lot of materials, which is good, but and some network. But when you start to get to the questions about, well, what do we actually mean for our society to be data-driven and enabled by near-instant unlimited wireless connectivity, that dream we have spoken about for years, what are the implications when we start to think about how society will actually change and adapt to this rising tide of use of data? Next slide, please. Now, the flagship is also looking at a range of different business opportunities, and they, broadly speaking, wind up in three areas. There are the resources and the assets, so end users, machines, enterprise, and public sector. There's the matching and sharing of data, and a whole lot of different services around that individual ring. And then there's the demands and needs. And historically, we've thought about communications networks as someone talks through a network to someone else, or someone provides a service through a network to someone else. But the opportunity for 6G is really multidimensional, because there are so many different data producers and data consumers. And in fact, in some cases, they may be both consumers and producers. The prosumers that we're starting to see in smart networks for energy, and the brokerage and the value-added services that are created in those different levels means that there are a range of different business opportunities and a range of different opportunities that that start to become possible, but we must sort out these issues of who owns, who controls, who has access to, and who provides and who guarantees access to data. Next slide, please. Now, one of the great things about the good folks in Finland is they've taken this very, very seriously. So 2019, we had the first serious 6G summit. 2020, we had another event, which unfortunately became completely virtual because of COVID. But we produced 12 thematic white papers with 310 global experts looking at a whole range of different issues. And I'm just going to dig into just a couple of those white papers, but they range from the 6G drivers and the UN sustainability goals, a whole lot of technical stuff around networking and spectrum availability and new business opportunities, but a couple which really speak to that challenge of privacy, security, and ultimately consent. All the papers are available via the 6G channel link on the right-hand side of the slide. And I commend all of these papers to you. They are very, very good. The last one, just most recently released, was RF Spectrum, and it's a cracking read. Some of them deeply technical, some of them talk to emerging business models. Next slide, please. So one I really wanted to speak to you about was the white paper, number 1, 6G drivers and UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's not at all a coincidence that this is white paper number 1. It says, this is all the tech, these are all the features, and if we claim to want to arrive at the world of 2030 with those 16 sustainability goals, the 17th is about partnership, but those 16 goals from no poverty through land and water, through smart cities and smart places, how can the tech that we are developing lead to influencing or impacting or informing those goals? And if the fundamental pillars of the 6G vision are intelligence everywhere, data everywhere, sensing everywhere, actuating everywhere, processing everywhere, connectivity everywhere, what does it mean in terms of how we change those, or how we identify and then change those levers that allow us to move towards that world of 2030? And it turns out to be really difficult, especially when you're thinking about a change in the real world, especially when you think about a change in the real world in the future. But through this exercise, we're trying to identify what those impact mechanisms are or impact pathways are between a bit of tech or a new standard or a new framework and how they impact the real world. And for any researcher out there who ever wonders whether your research will make a difference in the real world, trying to think through those chains of causation or influence or awareness is a really powerful way to think about whether your work will make a difference in the real world. Next slide, please. And that's part of the exercise of the 6G activity. It's hard, but it's actually worthwhile doing to think about, for example, how communications would impact goal 4, quality education. And what it speaks to is a complete need to refresh how we think about the work that we do as researchers or as regulators or as practitioners about impacting the real world, especially when we think about the future. Next slide, please. But there are a couple of slides, a couple of these white papers which really speak to significant challenges. And the one that I was personally involved in is white paper 10, which is research challenges for trust, security, and privacy. And it really comes down to the fact that if you bring all of these data sources together, you know where someone is, when someone is, what services they're using, and who they're related to or who they're connected to, either through things like the mobile communications capability, which we need to actually plan and optimize networks, which we need to optimize local capability, but also the services we deploy or pull down through our smart devices, then we produce some pretty significant challenges around ensuring privacy, the need to ensure security, and also ultimately, can I trust this network to deliver to me what I need to deliver to? Next slide, please. And then just another example is localization, hyper-localization of services delivered to you when you want it, when you need it. Next slide, please. And with this, I'm actually going to end and say that it's always a bit of a whirlwind tour. But what I wanted to do is point out that beyond the tech, there are a whole lot of issues that we need to consider about whether we really can live in the world of 2030 with the concepts we have today about privacy and consent, and think about our dependence on highly complex networks and the security implications of highly complex networks. And if we are to genuinely embrace 6G, all of the different things we need to put in place so that we, as people living in society, can actually adopt that technology. Thanks very much, Alex, for driving me through.
Thank you, Ian. Fabulous. If I can call all panelists to the virtual stage, and Ian, please stay on. We'll love to have you as part of the panel. I know you're keen to hear others speak though, but it would be lovely if you could join us. Just a reminder, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function. And panelists, we can all see those Q&A questions. So if you want to grab one as we go through, please do so. And also ask questions of each other, because that way we can throw that hot potato and then see what our learned colleagues have to say. So let's start off with just some basic sort of ideas that came out of Ian's presentation. One, obviously, privacy, consent, data protection. I wonder, Aurelie and Peter, if you could explain why this is such an important question. Why should we care about privacy and why should we care about consent? Is it just the compliance side? Peter, maybe you first? There's significant penalties to be paid if we get this wrong, but surely there's a bit more to the question than just the penalty.
Yeah, so by background, I was a privacy lawyer, so I probably shouldn't start by saying that I think privacy is a bit old hat and doesn't really address the key issues here. I think privacy is important, but it's only part of the story. And to illustrate, let me just quote from an article I wrote a couple of years ago. Smartphones have become an extension of our bodies. Smartphone data is the richest enduring record of how, why, when, and where we act, go, think, see, and feel. Analytics of that data reveals our likes and dislikes, our wellness and our illnesses, what we think about buying and then don't, what we buy and why we then bought it, and how we interact and with whom. Over the decade that the smartphone embedded itself in each of our bodies, it became the clearest window to our souls and our demons. The digital exhaust of our everyday lives has become a valuable commodity. Each smartphone is an authoritative record of some individual's life, including geolocation and activity state, brackets, and therefore sex life, close of brackets, 24/7/365, and subject only to temporary separation for recharging. Now that's really an explanation of why privacy is so critically important in particular a 4G and 5G world. But in the 5G world that we're moving into and the 6G world, increasingly the way that we will be observed, surveilled, and affected by devices will be by devices that we don't control. So the smartphone is theoretically a device that we control and at least is closely associated with each of us, hence the privacy issue. But we do have the ability to turn the damn thing off. When we're being surveilled by other devices that may or may not know who we are, those devices may be causing effects, causing machines or other humans to deal with us in a different way as a result of observations that those devices make of us. So the whole kind of notice and consent world, as it were, goes out the window when the device ceases to be a device that we control. And that really is at the heart of the 6G world. So I do think that privacy remains a laudable and important objective, but I think we also have to be humble about what we can achieve with privacy regulation. And in particular, we need to recognize that in this new world, individuated effects, ways of treating us differently from other humans will be possible without knowing who we actually are. So the issue becomes more than an issue about privacy. It becomes an issue about human respect, autonomy, our understanding of how people make decisions about how they will deal with us, whether they will deal with us at all, and whether they will discriminate against us. So I think the privacy discussion is very important, but I think it needs to be a much broader discussion around individuated effects. And that really is a discussion about human autonomy and what it means to be human, and our right and expectation to be treated with respect as humans, to be able to go about our private lives in public rather than just our private lives behind the doors of our houses.
Yes.
Aurelie, I know you and I have talked about this a number of times. I think you share that perspective.
Yes, Peter, absolutely. I'll just, so from in the world of AI, what happened was there was a big conference a few years ago in Europe with all the privacy professionals, and the title was "Privacy is Dead." And the reason for that was because there was a report from a number of experts explaining that it was impossible to get anonymization when you use different AI. You would always find the identity of the individual. And so that was the key title of the session. And to your point, privacy is not dead because now it's looking at it from a different perspective. The consent piece in the AI world is very difficult to obtain and to adapt to that new technology. However, what we're looking now is more at data trust. How do we manage to ensure that the way we use data benefits the individual and actually works for them? So if I have to phrase, for me, the way I see privacy is the start of that conversation where you make that the European Data Protection Supervisor explained very well. They say, you should not be limited by your data. The data is here to support you, to promote you, and not to imprison you. So that's definitely the way I see an evolution from privacy to the next generation of data rights, put it that way.
Fantastic segue into now looking at the technical aspects of that, Jay. Is the 6G revolution going to trap us in the cage that Aurelie just mentioned? Are there particular features that create privacy problems that we ought to be aware of right away?
To avoid any misunderstanding, also misquote, I must say that 6G is meant to be more secure, more privacy protection. It will be. Both industry and academics are currently working very hard to make sure that will happen. A good example is introduction of the blockchain technology to the radio access network. However, we must realize that 6G technology has the potential, I emphasize potential, to increase the risk of security and privacy. The primary reason, to my mind, is the vulnerability caused primarily by vastly increased complexity of the network. So admittedly, 6G has not been well defined yet, so people have various visions right now. However, most people are talking about really vastly increased complexity in the 6G network. Example includes the inclusion of not only terrestrial networks, but also satellites, called spaceborne networks, and also we call the airborne networks, including UAVs, high altitude platform, HAPS, etc. In addition to that, there are also the vision to include 6G, the personal body network. So all this increased complexity, in addition to other complexity in the network management, etc., means there be more vulnerability potentially. So any weakness in any part of the complex network will present potential security and privacy risk. So that's probably the primary reason. The second reason for potential risk is that I call it network defense capability constrained by limited power consumption or power supply. So city networks will have some highly energy efficient nodes with low energy supply. I mentioned the airborne network, spaceborne network. You can only have that much energy. Although everyone is talking about using AI and machine learning to defend the network, but to do so, you need energy. If you have limited energy supply, then what you can do will be limited. So this is I think two technical reasons we make that 6G potentially vulnerable. However, before I finish, I must say that the purpose of discussion is for us to fully appreciate the risks, not to say 6G will be more risky. Actually, it's the other way around. We have 1 decade to address all the issues. I'm optimistic. Thank you.
And let's hope we do address those issues. I know that you're a layering expert. Can we address that in perhaps a little later around the solutions? We've heard just now from the professor that it could actually be more, privacy friendly as a network. But do we need to look beyond that? This is a question for you, Peter. Sorry. Should we look to the human aspect and say, well, those humans affected by 6G enabled devices and the like, should they have an expectation to know about the risks that may be in that network because of those 2 reasons provided? Should they be able to control those aspects, and should they know that by a particular use that they're extra exposed? What's your take on that question about the human in the loop, if I can use that phrase?
Yeah, so I think the human in the loop is inherently problematic because as soon as we talk about control by an individual of data about them, it presupposes that individuals should have a level of knowledge and understanding of how data about them is being collected and may be used, that then enables them to exercise choice as to the information that they volunteer. But almost by definition, in a world where devices are pervasively surveilling us, observing what we do, firstly, it becomes far too complex for us to try and understand what each device is doing and what information it is collecting. And secondly, we generally can't exercise control anyway because there is no mechanism for us to indicate consent or otherwise. So I think the notice and consent notions of traditional privacy law go out the window. And of course, what lawyers like me say is, well, if notice and consent is problematic, then you have to transfer responsibility to the organizations that are deploying the technology that is collecting the data. So you shift across from so-called privacy self-management or user empowerment to a world of organizational responsibility and accountability. The organization that is collecting and analyzing the data should be responsible in relation to what they do. That also is problematic in a 6G world because often it's not clear which organization will be the, in current terms, the data controller because of the way that data will be moving and handled through the network. So organizational accountability in the 6G world can itself be problematic because it can be very difficult to identify which organization should be exercising responsibility and therefore accountable. And that's where I think standards will become very important because in essence, we're moving to a world where we need a federated approach to the management of data. And the only way to make a federation work is to have mutually understood rules between the entities in the federation and an expectation that those entities will follow the rules. And that is a classic example of where standards can assist. But I think even before we get to standards, we have to introduce a new principle, which is that any organisation which is collecting data that can be used to individuate effects, fancy term, put it another way, to treat me differently from how others are treated based upon data about me, even if the me is not identified. If somebody can individuate me in order to treat me differently from others, then they should have a responsibility to only do so to the extent that it is responsible and fair, and they should be publishing to the world a statement of what they're doing that is sufficiently clear and transparent that at least the advocates of privacy and AI rights can hold them to account, even if I, the consumer, can't really understand what they're doing or can't be bothered trying to find out in order to hold them to account. So I think we have to come back to some pretty basic concepts around fairness, responsibility, transparency, accountability of organisations through transparency, and then layer on top of that a standards-based world that enables data to move through federated entities with some understanding of each of the entities in the federation of what the rules are.
Well, that's a fantastic segue to standards. The terms used there sound very similar to the standards that are emerging around AI. And Aurelie, you're our resident expert. Would you like to share your thoughts on how perhaps the AI system of rules and standards may come through to help?
Definitely. And build on what Peter said, it's really, as I say, with those new technology, it's looking at all concept in a different way. So from trustworthiness and trust is becoming more important because you effectively having, there's a need to have a reputable, responsible framework to have many different systems. So not one algorithm, not one AI, but many of them making lots of decisions using your data and doing that in a way that's reliable and that will benefit you. So at standards, so we are now looking at the higher level on trustworthiness across technology. We have a working group that's just focused on that. From the AI perspective, trust, when you look at trustworthiness, obviously you need reliability of the technology, and for AI, what it means is looking at privacy differently, but looking at liability differently. So effectively, when there's many different AI interacting, you may not know who's going to be responsible. So you need a pretty clear framework to ensure that at least the technology you develop is of a certain quality, can be assessed, and can be transparent. So it's looking at those frameworks. So you're looking at the algorithm, but you're also looking at the data, because the algorithm is only as good as its data. So the data you collect, and it's going, as Peter said, beyond privacy from AI. You already see it's, we look at bias and which bias are acceptable for certain culture, which one are not, and how do you effectively get the AI to learn from those positive or negative bias and have an oversight so they implement the right one. So again, data, tech, and also the society, the organization, because as Peter said, again, you need different, like the oversight will be very different. So what kind of structure, what kind of risk management process do you need to have in place? And so we looked at all this ecosystem, and we do at the moment we're working on an AI management system, and this is extremely important for AI, because it will allow certification of the system. And if you've seen recently, I think everyone's been talking about it. There's an AI regulation that comes up from the EU. What they requires is for high-risk application that you have a conformity assessment before you actually even release the algorithm, that you monitor it regularly. And if there's a risk, you'll have to also get an assessment. So, and the way they do that, so is that they've set this up, but what they're going to do is rely on the standards that we've been working on at the ISO level. So that's the base for them to enable that certification process. So in a nutshell, what we do is really allowing repeatable assurance process that can give trust and trustworthiness, especially in that environment where systems are really operating with each other.
So we have only 9 minutes left. How is that conversation relevant to, say, the gold standard of GDPR? And are there countries looking at this and saying, well, actually, we have to start shifting our thinking almost away from traditional privacy to more an AI sort of understanding standards and technological solutions? So that's very quick answers, please, from Peter and Aurelie. Then we'll return to our professor to talk about other technical solutions that we can build into the technology, because it seems that's quite an obvious place to start to me. And then that should probably leave us 3 minutes, in which case I'd like final comments from all to wrap up the session. So the question around the gold standard, GDPR, where are we going from there? Do we move towards a standards-based system?
So we already have a standard on privacy that's mapping the GDPR across all jurisdiction. And that's the key piece. It's not just GDPR, it's all the regulation that will need to be mapped and embedded, and that's where standards can help.
Fabulous. Peter?
Yeah, look, I think GDPR is an important part of the story, but the bigger story is AI and technology impact assessment, having regard to a broader range of harms that may be occasioned to humans or the environment. And that is why we are now seeing such a comprehensive and radical proposal from the European Commission for AI regulation. It is a recognition by the devisers of the GDPR that GDPR is not enough. So I think it remains important, but there is a bigger and new story in town, which is how you regulate the broader range of harms to humans that can be occasioned by a broad range of AI-driven applications, including 6G.
Okay, and Jay, over to you. As a physical layer expert, is that technology going to help to build in these principles into the technology itself?
Yes, currently there are a lot of research activities on physical layer security, privacy, and trust, etc. So just to name a few, in the privacy domain, what people have been working on is called, generally speaking, called the differential privacy, meaning we introduce ambiguity to the spatial, temporal information. As Ian put earlier, 6G will have centimeter accuracy in terms of your position, but do we want to really show that to everyone? It's really personal information. So there are lots of techniques to increase the privacy level. The second thing is using machine learning techniques. We can, the user, the communication user can exploit the physical characteristics of propagation channel and the personal behavior, physical movement, etc., Therefore, we can introduce an extra layer of physical security. The other thing is what I personally love to do is always kind of complicated beamforming. The beamforming is a key technology for 5G going to 6G because technology such as the terahertz will have needle beams that will significantly reduce the probability of signal being intercepted. So there are lots of things we can do. The research currently is going on in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. I think you're in favor of me moving from 3G upwards. Thank you for your time. So we have 4 minutes and we have 4 panelists, including Ian. If you could please give me 1 minute each on what you would like to see, what we need to do now for the future, or just a comment about the future. We'd love to hear from you. And that will be it for us today. So Ian, we'll end with you. Let's start with Peter, then Aurelie, Jay, and then over to you, Ian.
Look, I'm not going to take my full minute. I'll take 20 seconds and say that I do worry that we still use the word privacy enough and not the word respect and fair, the words respect and fair. So I think we always have to come back to the basic principle that we humans should expect technology to be our servants and never concede to machines the control of our human dignity. So, and dignity requires, as I said before, the ability for us to go about our private lives in public. So I always start from that principle and then ask, what do I expect of the technology and data custodians in order to meet that requirement?
Thank you. Aurelie.
I'll support Peter and I say we cannot promote the dictatorship of the data. This is something we need to fight quite hard. And to respond to, I don't think in order to get the trust and to get the support of people, dictatorships never work very well in the long run. So to get the support and to get the technology to benefit us all, that's why we're talking about trustworthiness so much. But to respond to that question, to the question that's in the chat, it's always back to the organization and their responsibility, their risk management, the way they're going to use it. And so it's not about which bots got it wrong. It's always the organization that built that bot that did something wrong. So reminders that the laws are there, but we will need to, if we want to use that technology to seize that power, to be able to personalize a service and use the data, we really need to show the benefits for each and every citizen, not for a section of those citizens. And that's where that's where we stand. We're trying to really look at the socio-technical piece, and with ECPICE, I work also with them on that project, and on a number of ethics initiatives. So those two pieces, the people and is the essential piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Jay.
Hi. Although Peter did mention that he would like to use other words other than the privacy, I'm afraid I still want to use the privacy. So I was in the standardization activities for 3G that was inputted several decades ago. Now we move to 5G, moving to 6G. So in the past, the standardization activities have been focused on the physical layer, the network layer, then later applications, then security. I'm afraid until now, privacy has not been a major part of standardization activities. Moving to 6G, the network will be able to collect a lot of data from us. Anything we can imagine or else anything we can't imagine at the end. So that's kind of a risk. So I would really like to see standardization activity on privacy is beefed up. So citizens feel more secure, more protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Now, Ian, the last word. And you're on mute.
You're on mute. You're still on mute, Ian.
Thanks very much. I did a 2020. Thanks very much for the last word. Technology leads, society follows, and government and regulation are way behind. And I say that with some kindness for being a member of government. This conversation is important because we're talking about the future of the possible, but we also are trying to identify the challenges of now. So I think Peter's point about we have a choice, Peter's point that we have an opportunity to think about how we frame the future conversation is important. Aurelie's point that we are building frameworks to help us understand the temperature of the pot that we're sitting in. And then thinking about clever technologies such as Jay's pointed out, are all helpful. This conversation is important. If we do not have this conversation when we're thinking about 6G, then we have fundamentally missed the point that 6G is not about a next generation of tech. It's actually about changing society. The 6G flagship talks about moving from engineering solutions to human-centric solutions. And I think the most important problems we deal with, and as we develop forward, we are delivering solutions which help human beings be more human in a more complex world. So I think this conversation has been fantastic. And I really appreciate the fact that we are rehumanizing the conversation and rethinking about people at the heart of how this technology is deployed. And that includes my mute button. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you all. Thank you, speakers, for sharing your expertise, your insight, and all of those who've contributed questions. We've had a wonderful time. Enjoy the rest of the sessions here at 6G World. See you there in the future, and I'm updating my phone now. Take care.